What if I told you a United States soldier in Iraq dug up a letter from the desert that was written 4 years before he was even born, and when he finally translated the words on that yellowed paper, he understood why his grandfather never spoke about the war again? The summer of 2005, a forward operating base south of Tikrit, 98 degrees at sunrise, a 24-year-old corporal named Ethan Reyes was about to find something that should not have existed. This story sat inside a sealed United States Army file for 14 years. And if you want to hear the ones they still have not declassified, hit subscribe before you forget. The morning of June 14th, 2005, the temperature on the eastern edge of forward operating base danger had already reached 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was barely above the horizon. Corporal Ethan Reyes, 24 years old, born in a small town in Pennsylvania, to a mother who taught second grade and a father who fixed diesel engines, was finishing his 4th month in country. He had a quiet face, dark eyes, and a habit of writing short letters to his grandfather every Sunday, even though his grandfather had not answered a single one. Ethan was assigned to a perimeter sweep that morning, a routine task, the kind of patrol that nobody remembered the next day. He had walked this same stretch of dry ground 23 times before. He knew every rock, every crack in the soil, every faded plastic bag the wind dragged across the gravel. But on the morning of June 14th, something on the eastern edge of the perimeter looked different. A small mound of sand, no larger than a folded jacket, had risen during the night. The wind, the locals said, was a strange thing in this part of Iraq. It buried things and uncovered things on its own schedule. Ethan crouched down. He brushed the sand with his gloved hand. And underneath the surface, no deeper than 4 inches, his fingers touched something flat and dry and old. It was a tin container about the size of a paperback book, sealed with wax along the edges. He pulled it free, set it on his knee, and stared at it for a long moment. The container had no markings, no military insignia, no manufacturer stamp, only a faint scratch on the lid that looked like the letter EBA. At his bunk that evening, after the patrol report had been filed, and the rest of his squad had gone to dinner, Ethan sat alone with the tin container in his lap. He used his knife to break the wax seal. Inside, wrapped in a piece of waxed cloth, was a single folded letter. The paper was yellow, the edges were brittle, but the handwriting on the front was clear. The letter was addressed to a man named Daniel Reyes. That was Ethan's grandfather's name. Ethan's hand stopped moving. The date written at the top of the letter was September of 1981. Ethan was born in 1985. The letter had been buried in this desert for at least 24 years, written 4 years before Ethan ever drew his first breath, and it was addressed to a man who had never, in his entire life, set foot in Iraq. Or so Ethan had always believed. He read the letter 3 times that night. The handwriting belonged to a person named Walter Hammond, a name Ethan had never heard. The letter described a small village near the Euphrates, a long walk through a dry riverbed, and a promise that Walter and Daniel had once made to each other under a sky full of stars. The promise was simple. If one of them did not come home, the other would return one day to bury something at the spot where they had said goodbye. Ethan folded the letter back into its waxed cloth, placed it inside the tin container, and did not sleep that night. The next morning he requested permission to make a phone call to the United States. The connection took 6 hours to arrange. When his grandfather finally answered, Ethan asked one question. "Grandpa, who is Walter Hammond?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that fills a whole room. Then his grandfather, 82 years old, a man who had served in a war nobody talked about anymore, said 3 words. "He was my brother." Ethan had never known that his grandfather had a brother. Not once, in 24 years of family dinners, photographs, holidays, and quiet conversations on the back porch, had anyone in the family ever mentioned a man named Walter. His grandfather explained, in a voice that sounded much older than it had ever sounded before, that Walter had been a civilian engineer working on an oil pipeline survey in 1981, somewhere along the Iraqi countryside. Walter had written letters home for 14 months, and then the letters stopped. The family was told there had been an accident. No body was ever returned. No belongings were ever sent back. The case was closed by a government office that nobody ever visited again. Ethan asked one more question. "Did you ever know where he was?" His grandfather paused, and then he said, "I knew the village. I knew the river. But I never went. I was too afraid of what I would find." Ethan looked at the tin container on his bunk. He looked at the letter inside it. He looked at the desert outside his tent. The same desert where his grandfather's brother had walked and written and disappeared 24 years before Ethan was even born. The next morning, Ethan asked his commanding officer for permission to take a single day of personal leave. He explained the situation in 3 short sentences. The commanding officer, a major from Ohio who had a quiet respect for family histories, looked at the tin container, read the letter once, and signed the leave form without saying a word. Ethan, with a translator and 2 squad members for security, drove 40 kilometers north the following morning to a small village near the Euphrates. The village matched the description in the letter. The dry riverbed was still there. The line of olive trees that Walter had described was still standing, although smaller than it had been in 1981. Ethan walked through the village quietly, asking the elders if anyone remembered an American man with a survey kit and a notebook. An old woman, perhaps 85 years old, with hands that trembled slightly, looked at Ethan for a long time. Then she nodded. She led him to the edge of the village, to a single flat stone under an olive tree, and she said, in Arabic, that a man had asked her, when she was young, to keep his memory in this spot, until someone with his blood came looking. Ethan sat down beside the stone. He placed the tin container, the letter, and a small photograph of his grandfather at the base of the tree. He stayed there for 1 hour, alone, in the kind of silence that only the desert can produce. When he stood up, he understood something that he had not understood before. His grandfather had spent 40 years carrying a weight that he had never put down. And now, somehow, by accident, by wind, by sand, by the strange way the desert returns what it once swallowed, that weight had finally been delivered. Ethan returned to base that evening. He wrote one final letter to his grandfather. He mailed it the next morning. 3 weeks later, his grandfather replied for the first time in his life. The reply was only 1 sentence long. It said, "Thank you for going where I could not." Ethan Reyes finished his deployment in Iraq 6 months later. He returned home to Pennsylvania, sat down at his grandfather's kitchen table, and listened, for the first time, to the full story of a man named Walter Hammond. His grandfather lived for another 4 years. The tin container, the letter, and a photograph of an olive tree near the Euphrates now sit on a small wooden shelf in a quiet house. A reminder that the desert remembers what families forget, and that some letters take a generation to reach the person who needed to read them most. If this story moved you, the channel exists for one reason: to tell the quiet ones, the buried ones, the stories that never made the headlines but never stopped being true. Hit the subscribe button, turn the notification bell on, and leave a single word in the comments, the word that stays with you after this video ends. Next week, another American soldier, another impossible discovery, another story that the desert kept hidden until it was finally ready to be heard. See you in the next one.